My parents used to call me the placeholder when my sister was born and pushed me aside to make room. But now, they call me with bad news because karma has hit them hard. Growing up, I always felt like I was a disappointment to my parents. My mom and dad had been hoping for a girl. In fact, they had been trying to have a daughter for years without success until I came along. They didn't hide their disappointment that I was a boy. I overheard them say that it felt like they'd been given a spare. And I even remember hearing them call me the placeholder once when I was a kid. At the time, I didn't fully understand. But as I grew older, it hurt deeply. It became clear I was just the child they had while waiting for something better. My parents kept trying for another child, and it became the main topic of conversation at family gatherings or when friends came over. People would tell them they should be grateful to at least have one child, but my parents ignored them. They would say that unless it was a girl, they didn't feel like they had a child at all. When I was 15, they finally had my sister, their miracle baby girl. She was everything they had hoped for. They poured all their attention, money, and time into her. From the moment she was born, I essentially stopped existing to them. I was already barely there in their eyes, but with my sister's arrival, I became completely invisible. They hardly had time for me and made sure everything involving me was handled in a way that let them focus on her. She was their priority, and I accepted it. What else could I do? When I turned 18, it became obvious they didn't want me around anymore. On my birthday, instead of celebrating, my parents sat me down to tell me they needed more space in the house and I'd have to move out. Apparently, they thought my presence was taking away resources from my sister. I tried to explain that I didn't have anywhere to go yet and needed a few months to save up, but they didn't care. They said they'd fulfilled their legal obligations and I'd had enough time to prepare myself. I should be able to handle things on my own. And just like that, they kicked me out. I didn't have much, just a few bags of clothes and the money I'd saved from part-time jobs during school. I ended up crashing on friends' couches for a while before moving into a small, run-down apartment. Those first years were rough. I worked all kinds of jobs, overnight shifts at convenience stores, heavy labor at construction sites, just to make ends meet. I never had stable employment and was constantly worried about rent or food. There were nights I went hungry because I literally couldn't afford to eat. I had no contact with my parents during that time. I didn't call them, and they didn't reach out to me. No messages for holidays, no birthday wishes, nothing. I figured they had their perfect family now, and I wasn't part of it. It hurt, but I made peace with it. 9 years passed. I eventually built a stable life for myself. I got a steady job, a small but cozy place to live, and friends who became my chosen family. Then, out of the blue, a few days ago, I got a call from my parents. Honestly, I thought something terrible must have happened, so I answered. I hadn't heard their voices in years, and they sounded frantic. They told me they needed to talk about my sister. They went on, very dramatically, about how she was out of control. I was shocked. She's only 12 or 13. I couldn't imagine how things could be so bad already. My parents told me that my sister was skipping school, getting into fights, and involved in serious trouble. She was already experimenting with substances, hanging out with questionable people, and doing things that seemed far beyond what someone her age should be capable of. Apparently, they had spent a fortune trying to fix things, bailing her out of trouble, enrolling her in various programs, and paying for counseling sessions. But none of it worked. I get it, teenagers can be difficult, but it was hard to imagine a child so young spiraling out of control like this. It seemed like all those years of her being spoiled and indulged were finally catching up to them. But the severity of the situation was still hard for me to process. After explaining all this, my parents told me they needed my help. They wanted me to come back into their lives to support them emotionally and financially. They said that dealing with my sister had drained them completely, and they couldn't handle it anymore. They tried to guilt-trip me, saying that I was still their son and that families should stick together during tough times. Hearing about what my sister had become surprised me, but what truly enraged me was their tone. They weren't asking for my help. They were demanding it. Where was this united family they were talking about when I was 18, begging them to let me stay? Where was the support for me when they kicked me out without a second thought? Now, just because things didn't go their way, they expected me to swoop in and save the day. I told them no, that I wasn't interested in helping them. I also made it clear that I didn't see why I should get involved. I didn't raise my sister to become a nightmare. That was on them. They didn't take it well. They told me that if I wanted to remain part of the family, I needed to step up and help. After listening to their rant for a while, I simply hung up the phone. Since then, they haven't stopped trying to contact me. My mom even texted me, asking if I'd be willing to hear them out over dinner this weekend. Update 1: I wanted to share an update because things have definitely progressed since my last post. I also saw many questions in the comments, so I'll try to clarify a few things. First, I want to make it clear that I don't harbor any negative feelings toward my sister. Honestly, I don't even know her. She was just a baby when I left, and I haven't been around since. To me, she's simply a child I never got the chance to know. Any anger or resentment I feel isn't directed at her. It's entirely toward my parents for how they treated me and made me feel like I didn't matter once she came along. They were the ones who ignored me, kicked me out, and now expect me to come back and save them. I also saw questions about what my parents were like when I was growing up and whether there was abuse. It's hard to talk about, but I think it's important to explain why I feel the way I do. My parents weren't openly abusive, but they definitely made it clear that I was more of a disappointment than anything else. They wanted a girl so badly that they openly talked about it in front of me. I remember them saying things like, "Finally, we'll have a daughter to love," as if I wasn't already there. They treated me like I was just occupying space. After my sister was born, it felt like they couldn't wait for me to leave. They saw me as the extra they didn't need, which probably explains why they kicked me out the moment I turned 18. I hope that clears up some things. Now for the actual update. After reading your comments, I decided to take some advice and reach out to my parents. Many of you suggested that if I wanted closure or to better understand what they were asking of me, I should meet them in a neutral location. So I asked if they'd be willing to meet at a cafe in the city. They agreed, and I went into it with the mindset that this would just be a conversation, nothing more. When I saw them, they looked exhausted and much older than I remembered. They seemed incredibly stressed. At least they didn't waste time and got straight to the point. They started pleading for my help and gave me more information than they had before. Apparently, my sister's problems are far worse than I initially thought. Beyond substance use and legal issues, she's been in and out of multiple rehab programs, all of which my parents have had to pay for out of pocket. She's skipping school, running away, and hanging out with friends who are clearly bad influences. My parents admitted they've sold most of their possessions, including my childhood home, to cover the costs. They now live in a small apartment and are struggling to make ends meet. They even mentioned selling family heirlooms, but said the money would only last a few more months. It became clear they weren't looking for forgiveness or understanding. They wanted a solution. And to them, that solution was me. They needed someone to take on the financial burden of all the decisions they'd made over the years. Listening to them talk only made me angrier. They still didn't understand. They didn't see how much they had alienated me. They didn't realize that I barely knew them anymore, let alone felt connected to them. They didn't understand what being a family truly meant, yet they insisted I treat them like one. I let them finish, then told them I couldn't help. I explained that I'd worked hard to build a life for myself after they left me stranded, and I wasn't in a financial or emotional position to support them. I told them I didn't feel any obligation to bail them out of a mess they had created. They got angry and accused me of being selfish, of abandoning my family, and of being heartless for not helping my sister. It felt like nothing had changed. They were still trying to guilt-trip me into thinking I owed them something. I stood up and left because there wasn't much else to say. I keep thinking about their situation and my sister, someone I don't even know. I feel bad for her, but I don't believe I can save her. It's painful to realize that even after all these years, my parents still don't see me as an individual with my own life and struggles. This is a problem they need to solve themselves. After all, they're the ones who caused it. Update 2, I'm back because things have gotten even more chaotic since my last update, which was only a week ago. I thought telling my parents no would be enough and that I could return to my quiet, uneventful life. But earlier today, I got a call from my sister. It was the first time I've ever heard directly from her, and it completely caught me off guard. I barely know her. I only have vague memories of her as a baby before I left home. So, when I answered the phone and heard her voice, I didn't even recognize it until she introduced herself. I had no idea what to expect. I figured she might be trying to reach out, especially since my parents had already contacted me. The call started off well. She was polite, almost sweet, which surprised me given everything I'd heard about her behavior. She asked me to lend money to our parents to help them with their current situation. It was clear she'd rehearsed her speech because she was laying it on thick, talking about how they were struggling and how I could save them. But I stood firm and told her I couldn't help financially. I tried to keep a respectful tone and explained that my relationship with our parents was complicated and I needed to make decisions that were best for me. Then, everything changed. She went from polite to furious in seconds. She started accusing me of being selfish and abandoning my own sister. She kept saying I was turning my back on my family and even claimed I had always been jealous of her. She went so far as to say I was acting like I was better than them, just because I left and built a life for myself. She even claimed they had supported me all this time, which was laughable. Her words sounded rehearsed too, almost like she had been fed these lines. It was like listening to my parents all over again. She genuinely seemed to believe it was my responsibility to step in and fix everything. I was so taken aback I didn't even know how to respond. After the call, I knew I needed to talk to my parents to understand where all this was coming from. Why did my sister think I'd abandoned her? Why was there so much hostility and anger directed at me? I called my parents, and as soon as they picked up, I asked them directly if they had told my sister I had abandoned her and the family. At first they hesitated, but they quickly admitted that they'd been telling her for years that I left because I couldn't handle sharing their attention with her. They painted me as a selfish older brother who couldn't deal with having a younger sibling and cut ties with them out of spite. For years, they've been feeding my sister this distorted version of why I left, making me out to be the villain. It's no wonder she feels abandoned. She grew up believing I left because I didn't want her around. I hung up after that. My parents haven't tried to contact me again yet, though it's only been a few hours since we spoke. I'm honestly at a loss for how to feel right now. On one hand, I'm furious with my parents for lying to my sister about me and making her believe I abandoned her. On the other hand, I'm frustrated with my sister for lashing out at me and demanding I help, as if I owe them something. I wish my parents had just told her the truth about why I left. Maybe then, things could have been different between my sister and me. I might not have been able to help my parents financially, but I could have at least reached out to my sister and tried to help her change her behavior. Now, it feels like there's too much damage to repair, and I'm not even sure I want to. This whole situation is so draining. Just when I thought I was done with my family, they came back into my life in the worst way possible. At this point, I'm leaning toward blocking them all, my parents, for sure. But I'm torn about my sister. She isn't at fault for the way our parents raised her, and a part of me wonders if there's still hope for her. Still, I can't shake the feeling that even with everything she's done, it doesn't add up. Can a child really spiral this far, even with parents like ours? Update 3. It's been a few weeks, but it took me that long to gather the courage to call my sister and have a real conversation with her. I won't pretend it was easy. She still believed all the nonsense our parents had told her, but after a few moments I asked her to let me share my side of the story and then decide for herself what to believe. To my surprise, she listened. I told her the real reason I left when she was practically a baby, how our parents treated me, how they saw me, and how they put her on a pedestal. I made it clear that none of it was her fault, that I never blamed her for any of it. Thankfully, she seemed to calm down and wasn't as angry with me as she had been for abandoning her and our parents. Then I brought up the version of events our parents gave me about her being a troubled child. To my surprise, she immediately denied it. She said she wasn't skipping school, using substances, or hanging out with bad influences like they claimed. She admitted she didn't love school, but she wasn't doing anything remotely close to what they described. That's when I realized my parents had been lying to both of us. They had painted a picture of her as the problem, likely to guilt me into giving them money. I told her this, and she was just as shocked as I was. But then, surprisingly, she confirmed part of their story. They had sold our childhood home and valuable family items. However, she didn't believe it was because of her. She revealed what she knew about our parents' real issues. Apparently, our dad had lost a lot of money gambling, while our mom had a habit of overspending on unnecessary things. So, while they claimed they spent everything on her supposed rehabilitation, it was actually their own financial irresponsibility that put them in the situation. When I asked if they had sought help for these problems, she said she didn't know. They usually kept her in the dark about those things. However, she'd pieced some of it together. She'd overheard arguments where they blamed each other, our mom accusing dad of wasting money at the casino, and dad yelling about mom's shopping sprees. She also noticed the evidence. Mom always came home with something new, and dad often disappeared on Friday and Saturday nights, claiming he was going out. All of this explained why my sister was angry with me. For years, our parents had painted me as the villain who abandoned them and refused to help. Meanwhile, they were the ones who created the mess they were in. It's ironic. They spent so much effort trying to have a daughter, and now they've alienated her too with their own selfish actions. Before we ended the call, I asked her if she was okay. I was worried my parents might be neglecting or mistreating her. After all, I know firsthand what they're capable of. She reassured me that she was being taken care of. They provided her with food and other essentials. I told her she could call me anytime, and that I'd like to be a part of her life. She said she would, and for the first time, I felt like I had gained something out of all this. A sister. As for my parents, their attempts to reconnect, after so many years, inadvertently brought me closer to my sister. I don't know what kind of relationship we'll have moving forward, especially with them still in the picture, but I'm hopeful. At the very least, I've made a connection with her, and that's something I never thought I'd have. Update 4. It's been a month since I started reconnecting with my sister. We've been calling and texting occasionally, getting to know each other since we didn't have much of a relationship before. We talked about everything, her school, her friends, and her dreams for the future. I shared stories about my job, my hobbies, and the things I enjoy doing. But a few days ago, she called me late at night, whispering. I woke up to see her number on my screen, and my heart sank. No one calls after 2 a.m. unless it's an emergency. She told me she had to speak quietly because our parents had taken her phone as punishment. They had found her messages with me, and it made them furious. After discovering our conversations, they took her phone away. She managed to sneak it back late at night while they were asleep, just to warn me that she wouldn't be able to talk for a while. Her voice sounded off, nervous, and upset. She said our parents had yelled at her after reading the messages, questioning her about what we'd talked about. When she confronted them about the lies they'd told her about me, it escalated. That's when they punished her and took her phone. According to my sister, they only shouted at her, but there was something in her tone that made me uneasy. She sounded far more distressed than you'd expect from just being scolded. Call it intuition, or maybe just a sibling connection, but after the call, I couldn't shake the feeling that something more was going on. Knowing how my parents treated me, it didn't feel far-fetched to think they might be mistreating her now. Yes, she was everything they claimed to have wanted in a child, but that doesn't mean they wouldn't harm her. People who are unbalanced enough to throw away one child because he wasn't a girl are capable of anything. I spent a few days agonizing over it. I couldn't call or text my sister because my parents might read it, and that could make things worse for her. Finally, a few hours ago, I called Child Protective Services, CPS. I explained my concerns and asked how quickly they could act. They assured me someone would visit within 24 hours to assess the situation. I told them I didn't have solid proof of abuse, but shared everything I knew. Thankfully, they reassured me that they could investigate and evaluate her living conditions. I did consider going to my parents' house myself to check on her, but I decided against it. If they punished her just for talking to me, what would they do if I showed up? They could easily pretend everything was fine during my visit and then retaliate against her later. Plus, I'm not trained to spot signs of abuse, and I can't legally take her out of there without it being considered kidnapping. In the end, I realized the best thing I could do was contact people who are trained to handle situations like this. I'll update again once CPS has investigated and provided me with some information about their findings. For now, I just hope my sister is okay. Update 5. I know I have many private messages and comments I haven't responded to yet, and I hope this update answers most of your questions. If not, I'll try to go through them in a few days and reply more thoroughly. The reason I've been so busy is that I'm adjusting to living with a child, my sister, in my home. I'm sure you can imagine what happened. Child Protective Services, CPS, found evidence of abuse by our parents. Here's the short version. CPS investigated, discovered neglect and abuse, and removed my sister from my parents' custody. Now, here's the longer version. When CPS visited my parents' home, they found not only signs of neglect, like my sister not being fed properly, but also evidence that she had recently been physically abused. When my parents punished her after finding our messages, they had actually hit her, leaving bruises that were still visible when CPS arrived. A CPS worker spoke to my sister alone and reassured her that she wouldn't have to go back home if she opened up. At first, she was reluctant to share anything, fearing what our parents might do if she was returned. But once they promised to remove her from the house, she asked to be taken to my home. She told them everything, and later she shared more details with me. I won't repeat what she said here because it's too painful, but it was much worse than I'd imagined. A few days later, CPS brought her to my home. There was no way I could refuse, especially knowing what it's like to grow up with our parents. This all happened just a month ago, so we're still adjusting. I hadn't seen her since she was a baby, so it felt like meeting someone entirely new. But we're doing our best to adapt. For now, she's sleeping in an improvised space in my living room because I only have a one-bedroom apartment. Everything happened so quickly that I haven't had time to set up anything better. We're actively looking for a larger place with 2 bedrooms so she can have her own space. As for my parents, I don't know much about what's happening with them. They're prohibited from coming near my home, or my sister, which includes me by extension. Honestly, that's a relief. I doubt they want to risk more trouble given that they're already facing consequences for their actions. They're dealing with legal issues for the abuse. And on top of that, they still have their own problems: gambling, compulsive shopping, and significant debt. I don't know the full details, but my sister told me those issues were already significant before she left. Update 6. Here's a quick update for everyone following our story. My sister and I have moved into a slightly bigger place. It's not much larger, but it has 2 bedrooms, so now we each have our own space. Regarding my parents, all I know is that they've been ordered to complete anger management courses and pay a fine. It doesn't feel like enough. Frankly, they deserve jail time. But the most important thing is that my sister doesn't have to go back to them. That's all that matters to me. Their personal problems, gambling, compulsive shopping, and debt, are only getting worse from what I've heard. It's clear they're in a downward spiral, and I'm just glad my sister is out of that environment. For now, we're focusing on rebuilding her life and our relationship. It's not easy, but I'm committed to making things better for her. After everything she's been through, she deserves nothing less.